The wind cut across the prairie like a restless ghost, carrying the faint scent of hay and smoke from the distant bonfires. The sun had just begun its slow descent behind the jagged hills, painting the sky in shades of amber and blood red. She sat on the edge of the porch, her fingers twisting the hem of her dress, eyes following the slow gait of a lone horse returning from the north pasture. The evening air had a sharp bite, but it did nothing to chase away the heat that had settled deep in her chest. "Should I be afraid of you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, but it carried with the wind just enough to reach him. He leaned against the weathered railing, arms crossed, a shadow cast across the lines of his face that seemed carved by decades of sun, sweat, and wind. For a moment he didn't speak. His eyes, dark as storm clouds rolling over the plains, met hers and lingered in a way that made her pulse quicken. Instead of answering, he smiled. A slow, crooked smile that carried the weight of secrets she wasn't sure she wanted to uncover. It wasn't the question itself that startled him. He had faced challenges tougher than a prairie winter, dealt with men whose fists spoke louder than words, but there was a vulnerability in her tone that made him pause. It wasn't fear exactly, but something closer to curiosity, an openness he rarely saw in the world outside his ranch. And yet that curiosity was wrapped in caution, as though she had learned early that some men were better left at a distance. She shivered as a cold gust swept past, tugging at her hair and sending a stray ribbon dancing in the wind. She didn't move to grab it, though. Part of her wanted to let it fly, let the wind take it where it might, just as she wanted to understand the man who stood before her. The rancher, he was the kind of man the townsfolk whispered about. Strong, steady, and dangerous if you crossed him, yet inexplicably gentle when it mattered most. His reputation was woven from stories of late-night rescues during stampedes, quiet heroics in the face of storms, and a temper that could set a man running. Yet now, under the fading light, he seemed almost human. She felt a shiver of conflicting emotions, fear, desire, and an unspoken trust she hadn't known she could feel for someone so unpredictable. Every instinct told her to step back, to retreat to the safety of the warm cabin behind her, yet something deeper, something almost magnetic, held her rooted to the spot. She wanted to run, but running would mean leaving unanswered questions, and she had never been one to leave a story unfinished. The rancher took a slow step toward her, boots pressing into the dry, cracked earth. The porch creaked under his weight, a sound that seemed to echo through the empty fields. She swallowed, trying to steady her breathing, and found her eyes drawn to the way the fading light glinted off his rough hands that could tame wild cattle or build fences, hands that could hurt or protect with equal ease. He said nothing, letting the silence stretch, letting it coil around them like smoke from the lanterns inside the cabin. Inside, the hearth flickered with warmth, but it couldn't reach her heart the way his presence did. She remembered the rumors she had heard when she first came to this part of the world, the stories of ranchers who were merciless with outsiders, men who tested women with cold eyes and harder hearts. And yet here he was, standing quietly, offering no harm, only a smile that promised understanding if she dared to accept it. "Why are you smiling?" she asked finally, her voice low, unsure if she wanted an answer. He didn't answer in words. Instead, he tipped his hat back slightly, letting the wind tousle his hair, and for a fleeting second, she thought she saw the man behind the myth, the man who loved his land, who fought the storms and the winters, who carried scars no one else could see. That smile, though gentle, held a warning, too. It was a challenge wrapped in calm, a reminder that not everything could be tamed, not everything could be trusted. And she was standing right on the edge of it. A lone hawk cried somewhere above, circling the ridges where the sun had kissed the horizon. Her heartbeat thumped loudly in her chest, loud enough that she feared he could hear it, though he made no move to reassure or retreat. The prairie stretched endlessly around them, wild and unforgiving, yet it somehow felt intimate, like the two of them were alone in a world that had no rules but the ones they would make together. She wanted to ask more, to understand the depths behind that smile, but her voice caught, trapped between fear and longing. He took another step closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth from his body, the subtle scent of leather and sweat, and something she couldn't name but immediately recognized. Time seemed to slow as the wind played with the edges of her dress and the setting sun dipped lower. painting his features in amber fire. She realized then that asking if she should be afraid wasn't just about him, it was about herself, about the surrender she felt creeping into her chest, the part of her that wanted to trust, to lean in, to risk everything for a glimpse of what lay beneath his calm exterior. He finally spoke, but not with words that needed to fill the air. Instead, his smile deepened, and there was a gentleness in the way he reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. It was an unspoken answer, a promise, and a question all at once. Her own breath caught, and she felt the world tilt slightly, as if the prairie itself was holding its breath with them. Lightning flashed faintly in the distant mountains, the sky darkening faster than expected. The wind picked up, and the first sharp notes of a coming storm rattled through the trees lining the far edges of the property. She stepped back instinctively, heart pounding, yet she couldn't bring herself to turn away completely. Something about him, about the way he could make her feel both safe and on the edge of danger, kept her rooted in place. "Should I be afraid?" She whispered again, almost to herself this time, as if saying it aloud would make it real. The question hung between them, heavier now, filled with unspoken truths and hidden desires. And as he smiled, the kind of smile that promised more than it revealed, she realized the answer didn't matter yet. What mattered was the tension, the mystery, the uncharted territory that stretched between them like the prairie under the endless sky. The sun slipped entirely behind the hills, leaving the world in the dim violet of twilight. The rancher remained, steady as the land he loved, watching her, waiting and smiling. And she, heart racing, pulse quickened, mind spinning, knew that whatever came next would change everything. But for now, the prairie held its breath, the wind whispered through the grass, and the question lingered in the air, unresolved, daring her to step closer. The night settled over the ranch like a heavy blanket, thick with the smell of wet earth and distant pine. Lanterns glowed faintly in the cabin windows, casting long, wavering shadows across the yard. She stayed on the porch a moment longer, reluctant to step inside where the warmth promised safety, but also the suffocating weight of unanswered questions. His presence lingered like smoke, familiar yet dangerous, and she felt a shiver run through her that had nothing to do with the cold. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled softly. Wooden beams groaned under the settling weight of the roof, a reminder that this land had seen more seasons than she could count. The rancher moved quietly, gathering logs and tending to the stove, each motion deliberate, measured. He did not rush. That had always been the way with him, every action precise, controlled, yet somehow effortless. She watched him from the doorway, noticing the faint lines around his eyes, the calluses on his hands, the set of his jaw. There was a story there, one he did not speak aloud, and part of her wanted to know every word. She remembered the first time she had arrived at the ranch. The town's dusty main street had seemed too small for all the secrets it held, but the ranch, vast, sprawling, wild, was a world unto itself. Rolling fields, sturdy barns, and fences that seemed to stretch farther than the eye could see. The locals had warned her in hushed tones about the rancher. A man of few words, they had said, and not a man to be crossed. Some had even suggested he could be ruthless with anyone who got too close, yet kind to those he deemed worthy. She had felt a mix of fear and curiosity then, the same mix that now made her chest tighten as she watched him move. Her footsteps echoed softly on the worn wooden floor as she crossed the cabin to the table. A notebook lay there, its pages filled with sketches and notes maps of the land, markings of where fences needed repair, the grazing patterns of the cattle. She ran her fingers lightly across the paper, imagining the hours he had spent tending to these details, planning, observing, surviving. There was discipline here, yes, but also a patience that few could understand. She realized then that he was a man who measured the world not in moments, but in years, seasons, and quiet victories. "You always watch so closely," he said from the corner of the room, his voice low, carrying the weight of the prairie night. She startled, unsure when he had moved behind her. His eyes held a flicker of amusement, but there was something else there, too, caution, or perhaps a quiet warning. I just... She trailed off, unsure how to explain why she lingered, why she was drawn to him despite the warning bells that rang in her mind. He didn't press, didn't need to. She felt he already knew the answer before it left her lips. There was a story in his silence, a story of old grudges and battles fought against both men and nature. The ranch had not been built without struggle. Fires that had swallowed barns, storms that had flattened fences, cattle lost to sudden illness or rustlers who thought they could take what was his. And through it all he had endured. That resilience, that stubborn determination had shaped the man before her, now strong, silent, and impossibly magnetic. She wanted to ask more about him, about the life he had led before she arrived, but the questions felt too heavy for the quiet cabin. Instead, she chose to linger near the fire, letting its warmth chase away the chill while the wind howled outside. Occasionally, she would glance toward him as he worked, noticing the careful way he handled tools, the way his boots scuffed against the boards, the subtle movements that revealed years of living hard yet intentional. He was a man who knew himself, and she wondered if she could ever know him in the same way. Outside, the prairie whispered secrets she could almost hear if she listened closely. The rustle of the grass, the distant cry of a coyote, the wind threading through the trees all seemed to mirror the tension inside her. It was as if the land itself was alive, aware of the quiet dance between them, aware of the danger in drawing too close, yet holding its breath in anticipation. She thought of the day she had first set foot on the ranch, when curiosity had driven her across the gate and into a world that was harsh yet breathtaking. The rancher had watched her then, measured her presence like a man assessing the weather or the land. Something in her had shifted that day, a flicker of understanding or perhaps recognition. Now, months later, that same tension pulled at her, stronger, more insistent, and impossible to ignore. He moved toward the fireplace, lifting a kettle from the stove and pouring hot water into a tin cup. The steam curled into the air, mingling with the scent of burning wood, and for a moment she felt the world shrink to just the two of them. "You ask questions even when you don't want answers," he said, eyes meeting hers briefly before returning to his task. There was no accusation in his tone, only observation. And yet, she felt the weight of his words pressing on her chest, the reminder that some things were meant to be discovered slowly, carefully. Her mind drifted to the land around them, to the rolling hills and hidden valleys where shadows could hide more than cattle. There had been talk of lost treasure from the old frontier days, of hidden caches left behind by men who trusted no one. She wondered if he knew more than he let on. If the quiet glimmer of mystery in his eyes held secrets that went beyond fences and fields. And if he did, what would happen if she tried to uncover them? The wind rattled the window suddenly, a sharp reminder that the night was not fully at rest. She flinched, and he glanced her way, his expression unreadable. It was a look that could be mistaken for amusement or patience or warning, and she could not decide which it was. The tension tightened, a silent cord that wrapped around them both, making the air between them electric. "Do you ever wonder why some people stay?" she asked, almost to herself, letting the words spill into the quiet room. "Why they don't run, even when the world seems too big, too wild?" He did not answer immediately, only set the kettle down and turned toward her slowly. "Some things are worth staying for," he said finally, his voice calm, steady, and yet carrying a weight she could not place. She felt her heart catch, but also a shiver of uncertainty. His words were neither confession nor promise. They were a statement, and the pause that followed made it feel as if the entire prairie was listening. Outside, the first hint of rain dusted the dry earth, the faint smell of wet grass rising into the cabin. She glanced out the window, noting how quickly the sky had darkened, how the light of the lanterns flickered against the encroaching storm. It reminded her, in a subtle way, of the man before her, predictable in some ways, impossible to fully read in others. And yet she could not turn away. She was drawn in by that very mystery, by the silent invitation to step closer into a world both beautiful and dangerous. The fire crackled again, and she sat back, letting the warmth seep into her bones. Every sound, the wind, the distant thunder, the faint scuff of his boots on the floorboard seemed to heighten the tension. Each movement a reminder that this night was only the beginning of something neither of them fully understood. He approached the door, pausing as he glanced toward the prairie where shadows stretched long and dark. "Storms don't always come to warn you," he said, almost to himself, though she caught the words clearly. There was an edge to them, subtle but undeniable, a hint that life on the ranch was never without danger, and that the world outside these walls could be just as unforgiving as the wind that whipped across the open fields. She felt a tight knot of anticipation settle in her stomach. She wanted to ask him more, to understand the layers of the man before her, but something held her back. She realized that some truths might not be ready to be uncovered yet. Some questions demanded patience, and she had no choice but to wait, to linger in the tension that had drawn them together since that first whispered question on the porch. The storm broke fully then, rain hammering against the cabin roof, wind moaning through the trees. She stayed where she was, heart racing, listening to the sound of the storm mingling with the quiet strength of the man who had captured her attention, her curiosity and, perhaps in ways she was only beginning to recognize, her trust. And in that moment, with the world outside raging and the shadows dancing across the cabin walls, she understood that the question she had asked, the one that made him smile instead of reply, was far from answered. It hung in the air, heavier now, charged with danger, longing, and the promise of something neither of them could ignore. The prairie held its breath once more, and she waited, suspended in the quiet storm of their unspoken truths. The storm raged through the night, hammering the cabin with sheets of rain and gusts of wind that made the walls creak. She lay awake on the cot near the fire, listening to the rhythm of the storm, and to the subtle sounds of him moving about the room. There was a quiet authority in the way he carried himself, a steady heartbeat beneath the chaos outside. Even with the thunder cracking overhead, she felt the strange pull of safety and danger entwined around him. She couldn't sleep, couldn't let herself ignore the tension that had been building since the evening began. Earlier that day the ranch had been alive with motion. Cathal had strayed close to the riverbank after the afternoon rain, forcing him and the hired hands into the mud and muck to guide them back. She had followed at a distance, careful to watch without interfering, and she had seen how he moved through the chaos, calm, commanding, and precise. Every instruction he gave was measured, every glance sharp with awareness. There was a rhythm to his work, a deep understanding of the land and the animals, and she had found herself both in awe and unsettled. There was a rawness to his world she had never known, and it called to something deep inside her. The hired hands had noticed her watching. One of the older men, a wiry fellow with a face weathered by sun and years of labor, had leaned close to her as they passed. "Don't let him fool you," he whispered, voice low. "He's a good man, but he's got his own rules. You don't know what's beneath that calm surface." She had nodded, unsure if she even wanted to know the full answer. There was a magnetism about him, yes, but also an edge of danger she couldn't shake. That same edge had made her question her own courage when she had first arrived. Now, in the dim light of the cabin, she could still feel the pull of that day, the weight of the unspoken warning. She thought of the small things that had unsettled her, the way he had paused before speaking, the careful way he watched her movements, the moments when his eyes had darkened as if he were guarding a secret. Each of these moments added to the tension, making her wonder what life on this ranch had cost him, and whether she was ready to step into a world where trust was a fragile thing. The wind rattled the windows again, louder this time, and she turned her head toward the door, half expecting to see him standing there. He wasn't, but she could feel him, as if his presence had settled into the very walls of the cabin. She rose and moved closer to the fire, wrapping her arms around herself for warmth, thinking about the ways he had pulled her into his world without even trying. There were other things on the ranch she hadn't yet understood. The old barn near the northern field, for instance, was said to hold remnants of a life before she had arrived, tools and journals, notes of experiments with irrigation, the planting of fences, even a few personal letters she had glimpsed when he had briefly left the barn open. She wondered what the letters contained, whose lives they had touched, and why he seemed so careful to guard them from prying eyes. His past was a puzzle she was desperate to piece together, yet fearful of the truths she might uncover. Her thoughts drifted to the nearby town, where she had glimpsed the tension between the ranch and its neighbors. There were whispers of old rivalries, disputes over land, and claims that had never been fully settled. Some of the townsfolk treated him with respect, almost reverence, while others watched him warily, as though any misstep could ignite a chain of consequences stretching back decades. She realized that the rancher's calm, almost silent demeanor was not just personality, it was survival. Every smile, every measured word, every pause carried a lifetime of experience, of conflicts endured and dangers averted. As the night deepened, the storm's fury became almost a living thing, and she felt it echo the storm inside her. She could not stop thinking about the question she had asked on the porch, and the way he had smiled instead of answering. That smile had been layered with meaning, perhaps amusement, perhaps warning, perhaps something else entirely. It was a smile that demanded patience and yet teased her curiosity, pulling her further into the unknown. She rose and walked toward the window, brushing raindrops from the glass with her fingers. The prairie beyond was dark, the tall grass bending and thrashing in the wind. Lightning flashed far off, illuminating the land in stark white for just a moment. In that instant she thought she saw movement near the tree line, the shadow of someone or something watching. Her heart thumped loudly, and she knew that the rancher would be aware too. Whatever secrets lay hidden on this land, whatever danger had always lingered, it had not been erased by his presence. If anything, it had grown sharper, more urgent. He appeared then, stepping into the doorway without a sound. His coat was damp, the brim of his hat tilted just enough to catch the firelight. She felt a jolt of awareness, as if the storm and the shadows and the unspoken tension were all drawn into the space between them. "You can't see everything from inside," he said quietly. His voice was calm, even as the wind lashed against the cabin. "Some things have to be faced." She did not respond immediately. There was so much to ask, and yet each question seemed insignificant compared to the weight of what she already sensed, that the ranch held secrets, that his life was complicated, and that whatever connection was forming between them was fraught with danger. She wanted to step closer, to demand answers, but the storm outside made the act of moving feel both urgent and impossible. He poured himself a cup of the hot water she had prepared earlier, and then, without sitting, he stood near the window, watching the shadows on the prairie. "There's been talk in town," he said finally, his words low, careful. "People think they know this land, think they know me. They're wrong, always wrong. And they'll act sooner or later, whether we're ready or not." There was a quiet menace in his tone, the kind that made her realize the danger surrounding them was not imaginary. Some people in town had always resented him, and the resentments had grown over years, unspoken but deep. She wanted to ask who they were, what they might do, but she held herself back. It wasn't time yet. The tension needed to grow before the storm of action could begin. Instead, she watched him, trying to read his expression for clues, noticing the way his jaw clenched slightly, the shadow in his eyes. She realized that whatever history he carried, it wasn't just personal, it was tied to the land itself, to every fence post, every patch of grazing field, every creaking barn. The ranch was not just a home. It was a battleground, a fortress, a mystery all wrapped into one. Outside, a branch cracked under the wind, and she flinched. He glanced her way but did not comment, only tilted his head slightly, observing the night with the same careful vigilance he always had. There was a rhythm to his awareness, and she wondered how many storms he had weathered alone, how many times he had faced danger without letting it show. And yet here she was, standing close to him, drawn into his world, sensing the risk and yet unable to turn away. The fire flickered, casting shadows across the walls, and for a moment she thought of all the moments yet to come, the quiet conversations on the porch, the nights spent listening to the prairie, the challenges that lay ahead with neighbors, weather, and the mysteries of the ranch itself. There was a tension in the room that could not be resolved tonight. One that demanded patience and courage, one that teased her curiosity and tested her trust. He finally moved closer, placing the cup down and looking at her with an intensity that made her heart skip. "There are things you should know," he said softly, "but some things have to be earned. You can't rush it, and I can't force it. The land, the people, the life we live here, it doesn't give up its secrets easily." She felt both relief and frustration, drawn into his words yet painfully aware of what remained hidden. There were layers to him, layers to the ranch, and layers to the danger that lurked beyond the cabin walls. Every instinct told her to ask more, to demand answers, to lean into the unknown. And yet every instinct also told her to be cautious, to watch, to wait, and to let the tension build until it could no longer be ignored. The storm outside began to ease slightly, the wind dying down, rain softening to a steady drizzle. But inside, the tension remained, thick and alive. It was a reminder that the challenges ahead were not over, that danger could emerge at any moment, and that the rancher's smile, the same smile that had haunted her, thought since the porch was only the beginning of a story that demanded patience, courage, and trust she had yet to fully understand. She looked at him then, standing near the window, the shadows dancing across his face. There was a calm in his presence, yes, but also a reminder of the unknown, the danger, and the power of a man who had lived hard and survived harder. And she understood, with a thrill and a fear she could not deny, that her place in this story was not yet certain. She could step closer, or she could step back. Either choice carried consequences she might not yet see. The prairie outside was quiet now, the storm passing but leaving behind a restless tension. She felt it in her chest, a pulse that matched the rhythm of the land itself. The rancher turned slightly, catching her gaze, and the unspoken understanding between them stretched tight across the room. It was a promise, a warning, and an invitation all at once. And as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, she knew that whatever came next would demand everything she had: courage, patience, and a willingness to confront the unknown. The morning came slow, heavy with mist that rolled across the prairie like a living thing. The wind had died down, leaving only the faint scent of rain and the sharp tang of wet earth. She stepped outside, boots sinking slightly in the softened ground, and watched the ranch stretch out before her, fields glistening, fences sagging under the weight of water, the distant hills shrouded in mist. The beauty of it made her chest ache, but the tension from the night lingered, tight as a rope around her heart. He was already outside, moving along the fence line, checking the posts that had taken a beating from the storm. The sleeves of his shirt were rolled high, revealing forearms thick with muscle, sun-kissed and scarred. He worked silently, but she could see the intensity in every motion. There was a weight in the way he carried himself, a vigilance that spoke of more than just keeping the cattle safe. It was as if he were guarding something precious, not just the land, but the life he had built from scratch. She followed him at a careful distance, noticing the way he paused occasionally, scanning the horizon. There was a tension in the air, a feeling she could not shake, as if the land itself were holding a secret. The hired hands moved with quiet efficiency nearby, but their eyes flicked toward her more than once, whispers of concern hidden behind practiced indifference. Something was coming, she realized, something that would test both the rancher and the land he cherished. It wasn't long before the first sign appeared, a rider on horseback, moving fast across the far field, a dark shape against the gray morning. He spotted it before she did, eyes narrowing, muscles tensing. She felt the shift in his energy, the sudden alertness that made the very air around them electric. He didn't speak, but his hand brushed against the rail of the fence, steadying himself as he assessed the approaching rider. The rider came closer, dust and water splashing from the horse's hooves, and she saw the urgency in his approach. A warning, perhaps, or a threat. Her pulse quickened as the rancher straightened, eyes sharp, mind working faster than her own as he prepared for what was coming. She had sensed danger before, but now it was tangible, pressing down on them like the mist that clung to the grass. When the rider finally reached the gate, he slid off his horse without ceremony, mud streaking his trousers, and spoke quickly, almost stumbling over his words. "It's the neighbors. They're planning something tonight. They've been gathering, talking behind the hills. They mean to claim the land that's yours by right of cattle lines and old deeds. They won't wait." Her stomach dropped. She had heard rumors before, whispers of resentment, disputes over property, even long-forgotten grudges. But now it was real, immediate, and it could not be ignored. The rancher's jaw tightened, his eyes darkening. But his calm returned almost immediately, like a wave retreating before crashing again. He moved toward the barn, gesturing for her to follow. "We prepare," he said simply, voice low, deliberate. "We don't fight recklessly, but we don't let them take what's ours either." Inside the barn, the air smelled of hay and leather, thick and comforting, yet heavy with tension. He moved among the tools, checking firearms, tightening straps, and giving quiet orders to the hired hands. She watched, her heart hammering in her chest, aware that this was no ordinary day on the ranch. The storm from last night had been nothing compared to the one brewing here, one that threatened not just the land but the fragile trust she had begun to feel. She wanted to speak, to ask what would happen if the neighbors came, if violence erupted, if the rancher this man she had come to care for was hurt. But he did not pause, did not answer questions, only moved with methodical precision, each step calculated, each glance sharp with awareness. There was a rhythm to his movements, a silent code she was only beginning to understand. The ranch was his domain, and he would defend it. No hesitation, no mercy for those who sought to take it. Hours passed, tension coiling tighter with each moment. The sky cleared slightly, but the mist lingered, ghostly shapes moving among the trees. She wandered near the edge of the field, trying to make sense of the landscape, trying to see what he saw. The land was beautiful, wild, and unforgiving, a reflection of the man who ruled it. She wondered if she could ever match his resilience, if she could stand beside him when the time came, or if the coming night would prove too much for her courage. The first signs of the neighbors arrived as the sun dipped toward the horizon, long shadows stretching across the fields. Figures moved among the trees, horses ready, voices low but urgent. She felt the adrenaline rush through her, the pulse in her ears, the sudden awareness of how precarious everything had become. The rancher's presence beside her was grounding, yet it also reminded her of the stakes, of the danger that had been quietly simmering for months and now threatened to boil over. He moved closer, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "Stay here," he said, calm but commanding. "Keep watch, but stay safe. Don't draw attention." She nodded, though part of her wanted to follow, to stand beside him, to face whatever came with the man she had come to trust. She could feel the pull of loyalty, of curiosity, of something deeper she could not yet name. The neighbors came closer, voices carrying faintly on the breeze, their intentions clear in the way they moved. She saw the tension in the rancher's posture, the sharpness in his eyes, the way he assessed each shadow and shape. He was a man of the land, yes, but also a man of instinct, of strategy, of survival honed by years of storms, both literal and human. She realized with a thrill and a fear she could not deny, that she had never truly understood what it meant to live this life until now. The confrontation began slowly, a series of maneuvers across the open fields, horses and men moving with caution, weapons ready but unspoken rules guiding each action. She stayed hidden near the barn, heart racing, ears straining for every sound. Every movement, every word carried weight, and the tension was suffocating, a coil of suspense that left her breathless. She could see the determination on both sides, the history and pride that had led to this moment, and she understood that nothing would be simple, nothing would be easy. Time stretched, each minute heavy with anticipation. The rancher's strategies unfolded with precision, his commands quiet but effective. The hired hands moved with him, loyal and disciplined, yet she could sense the pressure mounting, the possibility that a single misstep could unravel everything. She felt trapped between fear and fascination, drawn to the danger even as she wished to flee, caught in the gravity of a man who had built his life on resilience and trust earned slowly. The sun dipped completely, leaving a twilight glow across the prairie, and the final phase of the confrontation began. The neighbors had pushed closer, confident, bold, underestimating the rancher's knowledge of the land and his ability to anticipate every move. She could hear their whispered arguments, their frustration, the edge of panic creeping into their voices. He stood firm, eyes sharp, every motion measured, and she realized that this was the test, the proof of everything he had built, the strength of his will and the depth of his connection to the land. Her pulse raced, every sound amplified, the snap of a branch, the snort of a horse, the distant call of a coyote startled by movement. She could feel the suspense tightening, the stakes impossibly high, and yet there was a strange exhilaration in the moment. The rancher had faced storms before, both from nature and men, and she understood that tonight would be no different. Yet she also knew that the bond forming between them, fragile but undeniable, would shape whatever came next. The shadows deepened, the prairie darkened, and she could see the neighbors moving in, unaware of the full extent of what they faced. The rancher's presence was magnetic, commanding, a force that made her heart ache with anticipation. Every instinct told her danger was near, that every moment mattered. and that the climax of this night of this confrontation was about to come. She had never felt so alive, so tense, so connected to a story that had been unfolding for months without her fully realizing it. She glanced toward him one last time, heart pounding, the thrill and fear intertwining, and saw the faintest of smiles on his face. Not a smile of relief, not a smile of surrender, but a smile that carried promise, warning, and challenge all at once. It was the smile that had haunted her thoughts from the beginning, the smile that made her pulse quicken, that made the question she had asked on the porch still linger heavy between them. The wind shifted, carrying voices and the scent of horses and sweat, and she knew the moment of truth was nearly upon them. The prairie itself seemed to hold its breath, the tension stretching tight as a wire ready to snap. She felt it in every muscle, every nerve, every beat of her heart. The night was alive with suspense, danger, and anticipation, and she realized with a thrill she could not deny that whatever came next would change everything forever. The night stretched long, but slowly the tension began to ease. The neighbors' horses had retreated, their voices fading into the distance as they realized the rancher would not yield. The strategy, the careful planning, and the knowledge of the land had worked in his favor. Every move he had made, every silent calculation had kept the ranch intact. She watched from the barn, breath coming in ragged waves, heart still racing, and realized that the danger she had felt so acutely was over for now. He approached her slowly, boots soft on the wet grass, eyes alert even as the relief of survival softened his expression. "It's done," he said simply, voice calm but carrying the weight of the night. She exhaled, a mixture of relief and exhaustion flooding her body. The adrenaline that had gripped her moments before began to ebb, leaving behind the warmth of gratitude, admiration, and something deeper she hadn't been able to name until now. She stepped forward, brushing mud from her dress, and met his gaze. For the first time in days, maybe weeks, she felt the layers between them shift. The danger, the mystery, the tension, all of it had brought them closer, had shown her the depth of who he was. Not just a man of the land, but a man who fought for what he loved, who valued trust and loyalty above all else. She realized that she had grown to understand him, and perhaps even to trust him completely in ways she hadn't thought possible. He offered her a small smile, the same one that had haunted her thoughts since that first question on the porch. "You stayed," he said quietly. "Even when it was hard, even when it was dangerous. That says more than words ever could." She felt a flush rise to her cheeks, pride mixing with the lingering tension of the night. She had followed him, trusted him, and it had made the difference. She knew now that their connection was more than circumstance, it was choice, resilience, and respect. The hired hands began moving around, tending to fences, checking the cattle, and restoring order after the chaos. She watched them for a moment, realizing that life on the ranch was never simple, never easy, but always purposeful. Every decision, every action shaped the land and the people who depended on it. She turned back to him, noticing how he carried himself steady, unshaken, yet softened in the presence of someone who had shared the night's burden with him. The storm had left a fresh scent across the prairie, and the first rays of dawn broke through the clouds, illuminating the hills and fields in gold. The ranch felt alive, vibrant, almost celebratory, as if the land itself was acknowledging the triumph of patience, strategy, and trust. She took a deep breath, feeling the air fill her lungs, and realized that she had never felt so present, so connected to a place and a person at the same time. He gestured toward the horizon, toward the far fields that stretched endlessly, rolling with life and history. "This land," he said, voice low, almost reverent, "it's not just soil and fences, it's a legacy. We protect it, we nurture it, we honor it. And we don't let it go without a fight." She nodded, understanding that this wasn't just about survival, it was about respect, love for the land, and the values that defined the rancher and his life. She realized, too, that the questions that had haunted her about trust, about danger, about whether she should be afraid had found their answers not in words but in actions. The rancher's silence, his careful planning, his measured presence had spoken louder than any declaration could. She had been afraid once, yes, but now the fear was replaced by understanding, connection, and a shared respect that felt unbreakable. He moved closer, hand brushing hers lightly, a gesture small yet infinitely significant. "You don't have to ask again," he said, voice quiet but certain. "You're safe. And if you're willing, you can stay." Her heart swelled. A mixture of relief, joy, and a quiet recognition that she had found more than just safety here. She had found a partner, a confidant, someone who shared her courage and matched her resolve. They walked together toward the cabin, the morning light warming the damp grass beneath their feet. Every step felt like a promise, a silent agreement that whatever came next, they would face it together. The hired hands gave brief nods as they passed, a quiet acknowledgement of what had occurred and of the bond forming between the two of them. The ranch was not just a place of work or survival anymore. It was a home, a shared space of trust and commitment. Inside, the cabin smelled of firewood and earth, a comforting reminder that life on the ranch was grounded in simple truths: hard work, respect, and resilience. She sat near the hearth as he brought in fresh water, their movements natural, unhurried. The tension that had dominated the night before was gone, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of accomplishment, the relief of surviving not just the storm, but the human threats that had loomed over them. They spoke quietly of the plans ahead: repairing fences, tending to the cattle, keeping the ranch running smoothly. But beneath the practical words was an unspoken acknowledgement. They had been tested, and they had passed. The bonds forged in tension and uncertainty were stronger than any spoken promise could have been. She realized that the rancher's smile, once a puzzle, had been a doorway, a sign of connection, and a hint that trust could be earned and shared. As the day progressed, the prairie seemed to settle into a calm rhythm. The cattle moved freely, grazing without fear, and the sunlight highlighted the subtle beauty of the land: wildflowers dotting the fields, streams glittering in the light, hills rolling gently in the distance. She watched the rancher work, helping where she could, and felt a deep sense of belonging. This was not just survival, it was life, full and rich, a world where danger had taught her courage and trust had taught her love. By evening, the ranch was quiet, the last light of day spilling across the fields in soft amber. They stood on the porch together, the air still fragrant from the rain, the prairie alive with the gentle sounds of animals settling for the night. She leaned slightly against him, feeling the solid strength of his presence and the quiet joy of shared accomplishment. The question that had begun their journey, whether she should be afraid, felt distant, almost laughable now. She understood fully that fear had given way to respect, curiosity to understanding, and uncertainty to connection. He looked down at her, a hint of that crooked, reassuring smile touching his lips. "You've learned a lot in a short time," he said, voice low, steady. "About the land, about life, about people. And about me, I suppose," she laughed softly, the sound light and free, a contrast to the tension that had hung over them for so long. "I think I'm still learning," she replied, "but I wouldn't trade any of it for the world." The rancher nodded, eyes sweeping the horizon, taking in the fields, the barns, the rolling hills, and the sky painted with the last colors of sunset. "That's good," he said. "Learning takes time, patience, and trust." He paused, turning to her fully, the faintest warmth in his eyes. "I think we've both earned a little of that tonight." The prairie seemed to exhale with them, settling into quiet harmony. The neighbor's threat had passed, the storm had cleared, and a new chapter had begun on the ranch. She felt the gravity of the land, the depth of its history, and the resilience of the man beside her. They had faced fear, uncertainty, and danger and emerged stronger, more connected, more alive. As night fell and stars began to glimmer above, she realized something profound. The ranch was more than earth, fences, and cattle. It was a life shaped by courage, respect, and shared responsibility. And in that life, she had found not just a home, but a place where trust and love could grow. The rancher, silent yet commanding, had shown her that danger could coexist with care, that challenge could coexist with hope, and that even in the harshest of lands, human connection could flourish. She rested her head lightly against his shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, and for the first time since she had arrived, she felt fully certain of her place here. Not just on the land, but in the life they would build together, side by side. Whatever storms or threats came in the future, they would face them as one. The prairie stretched endlessly before them, alive and untamed, yet somehow welcoming, as if recognizing the bond that had formed between the two of them. She watched the first moonlight glint on the fields and felt a quiet sense of triumph, of resolution, of belonging. The rancher's hand found hers, fingers entwining naturally, and she realized that every question had been answered, every fear confronted, and every tension resolved, not with force but with patience, courage, and trust. The night wrapped around the ranch, quiet and peaceful, filled with the promise of tomorrow. And as she looked up at the stars above, she understood that this was more than survival, more than trust. It was life, fully lived, shared, and cherished. The smile that had haunted her from the beginning now felt like home, a symbol of strength, understanding, and love. The prairie whispered softly, the wind carrying the promise of new beginnings, and she felt a profound certainty settle in her heart. She was no longer afraid. She was home.